Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. Surprised, I didn't know I was going first, but that's all good. So, hi everyone. I'm Bee. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm based in Merseyside. I'm a member of the SWT in Merseyside. So my day job is I'm a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University. I'm also the chair of my UCU branch, so that's the University and Colleges Union, for anyone that's getting tired of lots of acronyms, as I always do. And I'm the outgoing National Executive Committee rep for LGBT plus members in higher education. And until the end of this month, I will also be the chair of the LGBT plus members committee. So yeah, sorry, that was a lot of random information to throw at you. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the sort of some of my thoughts on the role of trade unions. And if I go on too long, please just shut me up. But I'm going to try to keep this nice and brief because I know everyone's had a long afternoon. So I kind of want to think about, I guess, the kind of dual role that we can have within our sort of as union members, as working people, and this way of like this inward way, the reflecting inwards on our own unions, and also thinking about how we can do work outside our unions as well. So first, I think I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I guess I have been doing a little bit in my union in UCU, but also kind of try and generalise these to some of the things that we can try and do in our own unions. And I, think it'd be really great if, I don't know how much of the conversation afterwards I'll be able to participate in over Zoom. I'm sure I'll be able to a bit, but to hear your ideas as well. UCU is obviously an education union. We represent members in higher education, further education colleges, prison educators, and adult community education. But the two bigger parts of our union are HE and FE. And I know we've got comrades from the NEU here as well speaking today. And I think, though it's important for all unions in terms of kind of thinking about what does it mean to be a trade unionist and to try and work towards liberation for LGBT plus people, I think, or I find that, as an educator, it is even more important that we kind of get our ducks in a row around these issues and that we make sure that we're creating safe, kind of radical spaces for not just ourselves but our students too. And this is something that has really kind of solidified for me in the last few years, taking on a national role in union, I tell this anecdote quite often when I speak at events, but it really hit home to me how important the work on queer inclusion that we do as a trade union. After I spoke at an event in Liverpool, and some students that were applying to go to university in next September came up to me and said, I'm going to X university, whatever one, is it safe for me there? Who can I talk to there? And, there is genuine kind of fear in a lot of young people for various reasons, which I'm sure you've been discussing throughout the day in terms of kind of issues around the media representation of queer people, but also the kind of extreme backlash that we're seeing across the media as well. And, I think we can think about it in terms of workplace. Is it safe for me to be here? Unfortunately, for quite a lot of us, it isn't. So, thinking about how we can work, what we need to do within our unions. I think the key, or one of the first things to do, is pushing forward inclusive policy in terms of our own unions' policies, but also our workplace policies. Our UCU Congress is coming up at the end of this month, and it's going to be a slightly strange discussion because the motion's going in to change our equality work to equity work, which I'm not sure it's necessarily better, it's just different. So I've put in an amendment which may be seen as hostile to say, why not change it all to liberation instead of any of those things. So we'll see. But I think we have to think about removing all of these forms of oppression as the end point, not kind of that old equality was who. We also have to work within our unions because all our different unions have different pinch points and points of really quite sharp struggle around creating safe spaces, creating strong policy, creating radical queer spaces, whether that's kind of pockets of transphobia in different levels of the union or kind of a lack of knowledge and things like that. So we need to be aware of what our pinch points are so that we can really tackle them to make them safe and radical and exciting places to organise. Unions really need to be places to build solidarity, of course, in so many ways. It's really crucial that straight and cis people are coming along with us on this journey. And I also think, not just because I'm from an education union, but I really think that education and equipping people to fight and to do better is important when we see these kind of broad, sweeping attacks, whether they're the big overt political attacks or the more everyday and perhaps more hidden, or even the more kind of specific, actually violent attacks that we are seeing increasingly. We have to be equipping ourselves to pick up and deal with anti-trans narratives, which come in many forms, in many places, but we really have to focus on debunking those. And I'm just keeping an eye on the time as well. So those are some of the things to do with being inside our union. My union isn't perfect. It has been difficult at times to be kind of trans, non-binary in the union, and to have kind of overt transphobia around me in certain spaces, and people being somewhat kind of either some people being very kind of strong and kind of coming straight back at that. So you don't as a kind of queer person have to, really strong solidarity, but also people who perhaps hide behind things like academic freedom and freedom of speech, and a kind of tendency in bureaucracies to be overcautious in terms of kind of dealing with transphobia within union spaces, but also in terms of pushing the agenda forward. So very briefly, I'll just say some of the things that I think we can do outside our unions or through our unions, but facing outwards. And this is also kind of a bit of a call to, if you're able to go to any kind of protest or any pride, take your union banners, be visible. Every workplace and on the streets, every opportunity, alongside other workers and other people. There's been points when I've been to kind of protests and I've been the only person that's taken a trade union banner, and it's kind of, you think in a radical political city like Liverpool, you would see a bit more of that, but unfortunately not. Even though, reform is always kind of limited, and especially with this government, I still think that unions can have a lot of political weight. So it's useful to kind of just be aware of how that's being driven, because we don't want it to be driven in the wrong direction. And kind of linking right back to kind of one of the first things I said, we have to be really brave, we have to be really radical, we have to be really strong. It's not just about equality anymore, it is about finding ways towards liberation. So I will leave it there because I think I've taken up all my time, and thank you very much.
Okay, I think it's really important that unions lead on LGBT plus rights, because the Tories are seriously trying to divide us. Day in and day out, newspapers like the Daily Mail spread hate and create a hostile environment for trans people. And this is deliberately designed to take attention away from the failures of their system and divert the anger and the real suffering and alienation created by those failures against those who are oppressed. The government gave a green light to this back in 2020 when they refused to reform the GRA, the Gender Recognition Act. The refusal to grant self-identification has created extra terrible stress and anxiety for those transitioning. But it was also a signal for those on the far right to go on the offensive and develop the campaigns of bigotry we see today. Worse, in January this year, Rishi Sunak used Section 35 to block the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Act, even though it was democratically passed by the Scottish Assembly by 86 votes to 39. Sunak was prepared to risk a constitutional crisis in order to attack trans people. Like Suella Braverman on refugees, the bigotry was deliberate. The results of that are no accident when we look around us today. We've seen the consistent attacks on drag queen story time increase, organised by groups like Patriotic Alternative. They stand outside venues for children's events where they're disgusting banners saying groomed dogs, not kids. They've made attacks on LGBT plus inclusive education, calling it child abuse. These attacks work in tandem with the attacks on refugees. The same people are on the protests outside against refugees outside the hotel in Knowsley recently near Liverpool, and the ones protesting drag queen storytime at the Honour Road pub in South London. The same people attend both. And tragically, this hateful transphobia has created and shaped the events that led to the tragic murder of Brianna Ghey. I've seen this before. I was a teacher, I became a teacher in 1988 when Thatcher introduced Section 28, which supposedly was to ban, quote, the promotion of homosexuality. It created a similar sense of atmosphere of hate. The sensational representation of LGBT plus people followed, calling us monsters, stalkers, groomers, sick, predators, as mentally ill, as other. The very people who were oppressed were demonised and turned into oppressors. People in the late 80s who had HIV/AIDS were demonised by the media. They deliberately created misery and discrimination then, and they are doing it now. But it's important to understand how that situation was turned round during the 80s and the 90s. And this is something people don't talk enough about, and shows what is important about the way people organise and why unions are important. Advances like the abolition of Section 28, same-sex civil partnership, same-sex marriage and adoption, weren't won because some nice people decided this from above and kind governments granted our rights. It came about through the struggle of working people alongside LGBT plus people. It's important to explain the change for LGBT plus people in society. It's impossible to explain the change for LGBT plus people in society without acknowledging this. In the annual British Social Attitudes published every year, in 1983, 50% of British people saw homosexuality as always wrong. Only 70% thought homosexuality was, quote, okay. This figure for people who accepted homosexuality as okay fell to as low as 11% during the panic about AIDS in 1987. By 2016, though, there was a 60% approval rate for gay marriage. How did that change? Well, I'll tell you, my argument, and I think it's an important argument to have, is that that struggle came from below. Unions were at the forefront of moving to positive public acceptance of lesbian and gay rights in the late 80s, and were way ahead of the curve of public opinion in society. None of these advances would have happened if there had not been a movement within the working class and in the trade unions that fought for LGBT plus rights. Anyone who's seen the film Pride about the connection between lesbian and gay support the miners and the South Wales miners during the Great Strike of 84-85 can see how ideas changed in struggle. But that had a domino effect. And what happened after that was that so much changed. Those connections between LGBT plus people and support groups and unions had huge repercussions. For example, since the mid-80s onwards, every trade union now has LGBT plus representation and policy. The Labour Party changed its position. And, of course, trade unions are mass organisations, which alongside other labour movement organisations have a huge reach out to millions of working class people. This is how things can change. This is how ideas can change. And I do think it's impossible to explain that change without understanding that context. These changes were too late to develop a fully concerted campaign to stop Section 28 in the late 80s, early 90s, but were key in forcing Blair's government to abolish Section 28 in 2003. And I think this is important to understand today when we think about how we develop a movement, a radical movement that can stand up to bigotry and fight for liberation. Union organisation and the working class can be at the centre of pushing for change. And that's why I think London Trans Pride this year, and it's the leaflet on your in front of you, is going to be so important. In my union in the NEU, over the last 2 years, we've taken about a third of all London NEU banners onto the London Trans Pride. This year we want to see more, and I'm working with Bee Hughes, who just spoke, in the UCU and with other unions to make that even bigger, so that we have a trade union block on Trans Pride this year that stands out and shows that the left and the unions can fight for trans rights. It means and in doing that, when we've won that position, it's meant that members have put motions of support in their union groups. They've won that and then taken people to Trans Pride alongside their banners. So the argument is had in the working class about why it's important to support trans rights, and the link between class struggle and the fight for liberation is made. It meant that lots of NEU members came on the march to represent their areas. There were over 10,000 on the first year. Last year it went to 20,000. This year we want to see many, many more thousands. And I think that's important because then I think it shows the importance of the fight. It shows that unions are behind it, but it also gives strength to those people who are fighting against transphobia wherever they are. Within the NEU, trans and non-binary rights have been at the centre of the union's concerns for the last 5 years. During that time, we've won support for GRA reform, support for a union definition of transphobia, and the development of trans and non-binary inclusive education strategies in schools. I have also helped design with others an LGBT plus charter to go into schools which has trans and non-binary materials for students, so that those go into safe spaces for students to discuss within schools. It's also important that we have strong unions in education, where 64% of trans students have been bullied and homophobic bullying still continues. In doing so, we've helped marginalise some of the leading members of our NEU union who have publicly supported Women's Place UK. We put the argument that the struggle against transphobia and the struggle against women's oppression is entirely compatible and not in conflict. And because we've argued this in a positive way to try to make it the common sense of the union, we have won over so many of those in the centre ground of the argument. These arguments are bound to reoccur, but we're in a good position to win them. It's important to understand that oppression is driven from the top. The media echo that, and that's why it sometimes appears that transphobia can be overwhelming. But the mass of working people are open to be won over, and there are millions of people in unions who we can win over in that discussion. Our unions are a key way to organise against transphobia. We have a world to win, and we can win it.
Workers' power has stopped me from going, and although it's sad, it's of course a good thing. And I mean, I'm sure that you've taken a lot from this event, and I think it's really important that this event was held. Fundamentally, we all know that the fight for liberation is far more than sitting in meetings and discussing things, although this is a great place to start. It's about going on the street and making change ourselves. But the question of strategy is the most important question that I'd like to argue. And the best way we can learn from strategy is by looking into the past to see where we've won and where we've lost throughout history. And if you look at high points of class struggle, we see ideas change so rapidly. I mean, Michael Dance talked about lesbians and gays support the miners during the miners' strike of 84 and 85. These miners were homophobic people. They were deeply sexist as well. Not all of them, of course, but a large majority of them were. Nonetheless, lesbians and gays support the miners went into a hostile environment, showed through solidarity and standing alongside them that ideas could change. I mean, we've seen the lasting effects of that to this day. I mean, I'm sure everyone's seen Pride, with the miners going from a homophobic, directly homophobic group of people to leading gay pride in 1985. I mean, we've all seen the film, or if you haven't, it's on Netflix, I'm sure. Find some time to watch it if you can. But I mean, fundamentally, this was only a start, and the miners' strike was defeated. The question would have been if it had only gone further. Now is there a place we can look where this has gone further? I mean, of course, there is. I mean, there's a stereotype of socialists of talking about the Russian Revolution, of Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, blah, blah, Russian names, etc., etc. And there's a bit of a caricature, which is quite boring. I mean, a lot of perceptions of the Russian Revolution are that it was some sort of big boys club with beards, red flags, rifles, and banners. But I want to argue, really, that it was far more than that. There was elements of the working class, of course, but there was also a deep tradition of fighting for the rights and for liberation of the oppressed. And I mean, when Vladimir Lenin called the Russian Revolution the festival of the oppressed, he wasn't just saying that out of rhetoric. We saw a fundamental shift in the way that society organized itself. And when we saw Leon Trotsky, a Jewish revolutionary, propelled into one of the highest positions in the society, the leader of the Workers' Council in the center, which was Petrograd, which is now called St. Petersburg. Only 5 years before, they were massacring Jewish people in state-sanctioned pogroms. To go from a deeply oppressive society where Jewish people were thrown into the fringes and murdered, to then propelling a Jewish member to one of the highest positions, isn't something that just happens. But in this case, it was. And we also see this with women. Women in Tsarist society, in the society before the revolution, were deeply, deeply oppressed. The literacy rates were minute. Many women weren't working, and if they were in appalling conditions. The burden of the family, like has been described throughout the session, was particular intensity before the revolution. After the revolution, we saw communal creches set up, communal kitchens, all attempts to lessen the burden of the family unit, fundamentally propelling women into a position where abortion was available on demand, where divorce was available without the consent of both partners, where if a woman chose, she should get an abortion. And the question is, I mean, this is great for Jewish people and for ethnic minorities and for women, but how does LGBT plus people fit into this? And this is one of the most undocumented parts of the Russian Revolution. LGBT people flourished after the Russian Revolution. We saw, after the communal creches and kitchens set up, what is described as sort of a little homosexual world by some of the theorists who discuss it. We saw homosexuality decriminalized 2 months after the revolution. That was 2 months. They flat out went, the state has no right to interfere with people's bodies, with what people do in the privacy of their own home. We have no right to dictate what people do in the bedroom. And alongside that, we saw the flourishing of LGBT spaces. And what is particularly missed is the fact that trans liberation saw the roots of being actualized in the Russian Revolution. One of the leading psychologists, Lev Rosenstein, states quite openly in a conference that women in Soviet Russia may legally take men's names and live as men. This was 1917, we're talking about over 100 years ago, and they already had the nucleus of what I describe as trans liberation. The idea that even in their heads and in debate, they thought that, hang on a second, gender's far more complex than this. Women in Soviet Russia may legally take men's name if that's what they choose to be. I mean, in a survey, one of the people who was discussed, who was assigned female at birth, stated, "I want to be a man, and I impatiently await the scientific discoveries that are grafting myself male organs." In any other society, these people would have been pushed to the fringes, they would have been demonized, and they would have been oppressed. And indeed they were 5 years before the revolution, even 6 months before the revolution. We saw LGBT people pushed into the corners of society, beaten, in many cases burnt alive because of the way that they lived. And we saw a huge shift in the way people were thinking. the fact that we even saw an idea of a transgender person over 100 years ago, before even these ideas had been the slightest way thought about in the last 500 years, shows you that something deep and thorough changed within the fabric of that society. And fundamentally, that's because the family unit was completely wiped away as a formal structure. Obviously, it still existed to a degree. Unfortunately, after a revolution, you can't just throw everything away. And in fact, they were invaded by 13 imperialist armies immediately after, which made the situation even more difficult. But because the Bolsheviks had the idea of the family unit as the origin of women's oppression and the origin of other oppressions, they understood that it was fundamental importance to start to wither that away. And that's why we saw communal creches in kitchens used to decrease the family's effects on women specifically, where women didn't have to go home and look after the children all day. They could go and do recreational activities. They could go work if that's what they wanted to do. They didn't have to cook if they didn't want to. They could go into a communal kitchen. They didn't have to look after their children. They could go into a communal creche. And it was because of this idea of the family losing its position in society and starting to be wedged out of place that we saw the lessening of the burden on women and fundamentally the flourishing of LGBT plus people. Like I said, this was 100 years ago. We're seeing ideas that we aren't even seeing today. And I mean, that fundamentally that has to be something that is celebrated and looked at. Now, these things changed very rapidly. Tragically, the Russian Revolution was invaded. Russia was invaded by 13 imperialist armies, including Churchill's the government. Well, it wasn't government; it was Churchill's armies, including America, and a brutal civil war broke out, which led to the conditions of Stalin, which we would argue was a complete Stalinist, state capitalist counter-revolution to the really flourishings that we saw in revolutionary Russia, wiping away any ideas of socialism. But what is fundamental is that in 5 years' time, we saw change that we'd never seen before. And fundamentally, this is something they must grapple with and find really beautiful. Now, this didn't just spring out of nowhere. We have to be really clear on this. This wasn't just revolution happened, women became less oppressed. There were fundamental ideas that were put in place beforehand, and the core of this was the Bolshevik Party and their ideas of oppression politics. In 1902, we're talking about 15 years before the revolution, Vladimir Lenin wrote in his theses arguing for a revolutionary party that revolutionaries should be the tribunes of the oppressed, able to react to any manifestation of oppression wherever it takes place inside the class. This is 15 years before the revolution, and the guiding idea that revolutionaries shouldn't just be sort of trade unionists, but should also be the tribunes of the oppressed, showed and proved in practice that being a Marxist isn't just about being a bearded man reading books, sitting in the library, talking to trade unionists on pickets. I mean, sure, there are many people inside the socialist politics parties who do have beards, and there are many people who sit in libraries all the time reading. Unfortunately, I can do my degree, so that's what I've been doing a lot of. And fundamentally, going on picket lines is crucial. What it shows is that being a revolutionary is far more than that. It means engaging with the class, seeing how best to react to class oppression, and fundamentally seeing how best it is to react to any manifestation of oppression, whether that be anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, trans oppression, non-binary oppression, gay oppression, disability oppression. Fundamentally, this was the idea that the Bolsheviks proved in practice, and this was in practice. In the February Revolution, which was the revolution that took place just before 1917, the women workers were the first people to go out on strike and to lead others out to demand the Tsarist state be destroyed. And it was Bolsheviks who were inside those factories arguing that on the principle that they should be the tribunes of the oppressed. The ideas of LGBT liberation in Russia didn't just spring out of nowhere. They were formed through the ideology and the practice of the Bolshevik Party. I fundamentally argued that the family unit wasn't even a question for many ordinary workers until the Bolshevik Party put that in place. If it had been any other group that had taken power during the revolutionary uprising in 1917, there's a high chance that the family unit wouldn't have even been discussed and that women wouldn't have been in a position that they were. It is the idea of the party, the idea of fighting oppression wherever we see it, and the idea to go into hostile environments and to argue that allowed the situation we saw afterwards. And fundamentally, that leads me on to my last point. I know I'm going over, but I hope that you can sit around for a bit longer. I'm sure bookmarks will keep the lights on for your social. The party and the Bolshevik Party was the core of allowing the liberation of LGBT people in revolutionary Russia. Now, it didn't go far enough, and we lost huge gains that we had after the Stalinist counter-revolution. But what fundamentally is the question is, where do we go from now? We can be individual activists, sure, and if you look at the slogans of the gay movement in the 1960s and 70s, they were, you should come out and be open and proud to be LGBT+, and that's how we can deal with gay oppression. Now, I agree with that. If you're in a position to come out, please do. But fundamentally, and I hope you've learned this from the sessions that we've been to, what is the fundamental question about fighting LGBT oppression is taking on the system itself. Yeah, sure, you can come out and be proud and be LGBT, which I am myself. I'm sure I'm very proud to have a beautiful girlfriend and to be trans in such a hostile environment. The question is, how do we tackle the capitalist system? Sure, we can be individual Marxists, we can read books, we can go to lectures, and we can talk in the pub. But how do we change the fabric of society? The fabric of society is changed by mass working class action and arguments within the movement. And the only way to do that fundamentally is to be in an organized revolutionary party where democracy is at the highest degree and where taking seriously the question of oppression is at the highest degree also. Sure, the Bolsheviks weren't perfect, and sure, we shouldn't mirror ourselves exactly. But hopefully what you've understood from this is that fundamentally the question of a party is the highest question that we can discuss. And that's why I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and that's why I'd encourage anyone else to join. There'll be join forms around the room, and there'll be people there to talk to and discuss why you should become a member. Because fundamentally, we're fighting for a better future, and you can fight alone, or you can fight together in an organised body of organised working class people who take seriously the questions of oppression, take seriously the questions of trade unions, and take seriously the question of revolution. And that's why I think that everybody here should be a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and should drive forward not only for a socialist society, but a society with LGBT+ liberation, where we can all live comfortable, good lives, and where we can live and love who we want and be
Thank you,
who we
Comrade.
want.
Can you sum up, please?
I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.